There's a small town in northern Pennsylvania called Ashwood, a quiet place surrounded by forests so thick they swallow the sky. Hardly anyone outside the state has heard of it. Yet if you were to sit in one of the diners along its single main street and ask the locals about the keeper, you'd see their faces shift. Some will stiffen, others will laugh nervously, and a few, those who've been here long enough, will simply get up and leave. The keeper was not a ghost, not a legend. He was a man, a real man who lived, breathed, hunted, and killed in Ashwood from the late 1970s into the 1990s. His story has never been fully told, because most people here prefer silence. But silence has a way of festering, and the keeper's shadow has never lifted from this place. What you're about to hear is not an urban legend. It is not a campfire tale. It is a reconstruction, pieced together from police reports, old newspaper clippings, and interviews with those who still remember. What makes it most disturbing is not the gore, not the blood-stained barns or shallow graves in the woods, but the way he lived among them, smiled among them, and no one truly saw what he was until it was far too late. This is the story of Thomas Grail, the man Ashwood would forever call the keeper. It started, at least in the eyes of the public, with a girl named Marcy Dower. She was 17 years old in the summer of 1978. Blonde hair, cheerleader, one of those small-town golden girls who everybody knew. On July 16th, Marcy was supposed to meet friends at the county fair. She left her parents' farmhouse around 7:30 p.m., cut across a gravel road that led past the woods, and never arrived. At first, nobody panicked. Teenagers were teenagers. Maybe she'd gone joyriding. Maybe she'd run off with a boyfriend she hadn't told her parents about. But when midnight came, and then dawn, and still no sign of her, the sheriff's office got involved. The search lasted 3 weeks. Hundreds of volunteers combed through fields, barns, creek beds. Helicopters circled overhead. They dragged the lake. Nothing. Not a single trace. The town whispered theories. Some said she'd run away to New York. Others said she'd been picked up by a drifter. A few of the older folks muttered about the woods, how bad things lived under those trees, but nobody really listened. By the end of the summer, the case went cold. Marcy Dower's smiling school photo went up on the bulletin board in the sheriff's office. One more missing girl in America. It would be 15 years before anyone found out what really happened to her. Thomas Grail was 32 years old that summer. He worked at the local lumber mill, quiet man, kept himself. If you looked at him, you wouldn't see anything unusual. Average height, a bit broad in the shoulders, brown hair, thinning on top. His co-workers said he wasn't much of a talker, but polite. He always carried a notebook in his breast pocket. He'd scribble things down on his lunch break, though no one ever asked what. He lived on the outskirts of town, on a property that had belonged to his grandfather. A sagging farmhouse with peeling white paint and a barn that leaned like it might fallen on itself any day. Locals called it the Grail Place, though most folks avoided it. Not out of fear, just because Thomas never invited anyone over. The truth, of course, is that people like Thomas survive because they seem ordinary. Invisible. The kind of man you pass in a grocery aisle and forget a second later. But Thomas Grail was not ordinary. In his barn, beneath floorboards blackened with oil and dust, he had built something. A place no one knew about. A place that would come to be known, years later, as the keeper's room. Detectives who finally stepped inside it described the smell first. A smell that clung to your hair and clothes long after you left. Rot, mold, and something sweet underneath. The room wasn't large. 16 by 16 feet, concrete floor. A cot pushed against the wall. Chains bolted into the studs. Shelves lined with jars. Old Polaroids tacked up like trophies. And notebooks. Dozens of them. Leather-bound, some falling apart. Each page filled in Thomas Grail's blocky handwriting. The first entries were mundane, grocery lists, reminders. But soon they shifted. Observations of women in town. Descriptions of their routines. Where they walked, when they were alone, what kind of shoes they wore. His language was detached, clinical, but there was hunger between the lines. Then came the names. Marcy Dower. Her name appeared on July 10th, 6 days before she vanished. Beside it, 7:42 p.m., alone on road by Old Quarry. Pattern repeats every Sunday. Opportunity window, 6 minutes. The rest of the entry is too disturbing to repeat word for word. Back in 1978, Ashwood didn't suspect Thomas Grail. Why would they? He was quiet, yes, but not strange enough to stand out. After Marcy disappeared, Thomas showed up at work every day. He helped his neighbors fix fences. He sat in the back pew at church. He nodded politely when people spoke to him. And in the evenings, while the town slept, he wrote in his notebooks. Over the next 5 years, at least 6 more young women vanished within 20 miles of Ashwood. Their names are almost forgotten now, except by their families. Denise Holt, 19, last seen at a laundromat in 79. Barbara Klein, 21, hitchhiking home from college in 81. 2 sisters, Ann and Kelly Morris, both gone the same night in 83. The sheriff blamed drifters. The newspapers moved on quickly. The town told itself bad luck had simply struck again and again. But Thomas Grail was still there, taking notes, keeping track, collecting, and the keeper's room was filling. The first sign that Thomas Grail wasn't invisible to everyone came in the fall of 1984. Her name was Laura Whitman, a 24-year-old waitress at a roadside diner just outside Ashwood. She worked late shifts, often walking the mile home along Route 9 after midnight. People warned her not to. Too many accidents, too many stories about women vanishing, but Laura was stubborn. On October 2nd, just after 1 a.m., she noticed a truck slowing down behind her. It was old, a Ford with rust creeping up its sides. The driver leaned across the passenger seat and offered her a ride. She refused. The truck crawled along beside her for another 20 yards, then pulled ahead and disappeared. She thought that was the end of it. Half an hour later, as she cut through the path behind Miller's cornfield, someone grabbed her from behind. A cloth pressed over her mouth. The stench of chemicals burned her nose. She kicked, bit, scratched. She remembered the sound of boots on gravel, and then darkness. When she woke, she was lying on a concrete floor in a small room. Her wrists were chained. Her head pounded. She didn't know it then, but she was in the keeper's room. Laura would later describe hours, maybe days, of silence. He never spoke to her, never touched her in the way people imagine. He watched, wrote in his notebook, left food on a tray, took Polaroids while she slept. And then, one night, something went wrong. The chain on her wrist was loose, maybe from rust, maybe from his mistake. Laura yanked hard. The bolt came free from the wall with a crack that echoed through the barn. She didn't wait. She swung the length of chain at him when he entered, catching him across the jaw. Blood sprayed from his mouth. He dropped his notebook. Laura bolted. She ran barefoot through the cornfields, bleeding, half-mad, until she reached the highway. A trucker found her at dawn, trembling, incoherent. She told the police everything. The room, the chains, the man with thinning hair and a quiet voice. They listened. They wrote it down. And then, nothing happened. Sheriff Charles Donnelly was in charge of the case at the time. His official report still exists in the Ashwood County Archives. It reads like this. Subject claims she was abducted and held by unknown male in an unknown location. No visible injuries consistent with restraint, only bruises. Subject statements inconsistent, potentially influenced by fatigue, alcohol, or emotional distress. Unable to confirm details. Case suspended. That was it. Laura Whitman was dismissed. Labeled hysterical, unreliable. A waitress who probably drank too much after her shift and spun a story out of fear. Thomas Grail returned to work 2 days later with a swollen lip. He told his co-workers he'd fallen off a ladder. They laughed, believed him, and in his notebooks on the page dated October 6th, 1984, he wrote only one sentence. Error, never again. From that night on, Thomas grew more careful. He began building false walls in his barn, layering soundproofing materials. He buried discarded items deeper in the woods, choosing remote hollows no one visited. He stopped targeting women in Ashwood directly, driving instead to nearby towns where his face wasn't known. But he never stopped writing. The notebooks became colder, more precise. He recorded measurements, times, distances. He cataloged screams, described them in detail, compared them like a scientist studying birdsong. By 1986, at least 4 more women were gone. Their families pleaded with police. Flyers went up. Search parties combed the forest again. But with no bodies, no evidence, no proof beyond the word of one dismissed waitress, the cases dissolved into silence. And Ashwood went back to sleep. The keeper's room was no longer enough for him. Thomas started filling the farmhouse itself with trophies. Locks of hair in jars, earrings lined up in rows, shoes stacked neatly in boxes, each item tagged with a date. Neighbors who visited, rare as that was, never saw. He kept the doors locked, curtains drawn. He mowed his lawn, waved politely when cars passed, and went about his life. But inside, the walls whispered. One detail, unearthed later in his notebooks, is especially chilling. For every woman he took, he created an index card. On the front, her name, age, date of disappearance. On the back, a single sentence, written in his careful block letters. Marcy Dower's card read, "She smiled too easily." Denise Holt's, "She never looked behind her." The Morris sisters' shared card. Together, always together. By 1989, the shoebox of index cards held 13 names. The closest anyone came to discovering him before the 1990s happened on a cold November day in 1989. A group of hunters was tracking deer in the woods behind Grail's property. One of them, a man named Carl Fenton, noticed a foul smell near a fallen oak. Curious, he prodded the ground with his boot and found the soil loose. They dug. What they uncovered was not a body, but bones. Small, pale, gnawed by animals. Carl reported it to the sheriff's office. A deputy came out, bagged the fragments, and sent them to the state lab. Weeks later, the report came back. Animal remains. Likely a deer, partially decomposed. The hunters shrugged it off. The town forgot. Only years later, when the bones were re-examined, did anyone realize the truth. They had belonged to a young woman, her skull fractured, her jaw still bearing the faint outline of teeth. But by then, Thomas Grail was gone. The event that finally tore the silence open came in the summer of 1993. It was August, sticky hot, the kind of heat that makes the woods hum with insects. Thomas had lived in Ashwood nearly 50 years by then. He was 47, graying, still working at the mill, still invisible. But on the night of August 12th, a fire broke out on his property. Neighbors saw smoke rising from the barn around 2 a.m. Flames lit the trees. Someone called the volunteer fire department. By the time they arrived, the barn was half collapsed. The fire roared too fiercely to save it. They focused instead on keeping the flames from spreading to the house. Thomas Grail stood on his lawn in pajamas, silent, watching his secret burn. The next morning, when the ash cooled, they found something. Not just charwood, not just metal scraps. Chains, bolts twisted by heat. Fragments of photographs curled into black husks. And beneath the floorboards, bone. Human bone. The sheriff's office sealed the property. The FBI was called. And suddenly, the town of Ashwood realized the monster had been living among them all along. The fire should have erased everything. That's what investigators believed at first. But Ash has a way of telling stories. Agents sifted through the rubble with gloved hands, filling bags with debris. Most of it was ordinary, splintered wood, melted nails, shards of glass. Yet buried beneath the remains of what had once been the keeper's room, they uncovered items that should never have survived. A length of chain bolted to a concrete slab. A scorched Polaroid photograph, the image ghostly but still visible, showing a young woman with her hands bound, eyes wide with terror. A notebook, edges charred, its words smudged but legible. The notebook was worse than the photo. On its first page, written in block letters, was a list of names. 15 of them, each with a date, each with a single word beside it. Words like kept, watched, buried. At the bottom, one final line. Fire cleanses what time cannot. Thomas Grail was brought in for questioning on August 14th, 1993. The interview tapes still exist in the Ashwood County Evidence Archive. The recording is grainy, the audio faint, but his voice carries clearly. He denied everything. When agents showed him the photographs, he claimed they were planted. When they asked about the notebooks, he said they were fiction, stories he had been writing for years. A hobby, nothing more. His face never wavered. Calm, polite, almost bored. Neighbors described the same man they'd known for decades. Quiet, hard-working, a little strange, but harmless. One woman even swore she'd seen him help rescue kittens from under her porch the year before. The town was split in two. Half believed the evidence. Half believed Thomas Grayle was being framed. The sheriff himself admitted he'd never once suspected the man. "If you'd asked me to pick the monster in town," he told a reporter later, "I'd have named 10 other people before him." But evidence doesn't lie. And the FBI wasn't about to let Ashwood's silence bury the truth again. The investigation widened. Agents combed through Grayle's property. They tore up floorboards, dug holes in the yard, opened every box and drawer. What they found turned Ashwood from a quiet lumber town into a national headline. In the cellar, 15 jars, each containing locks of hair. In a trunk, shoes, dozens of them, some still caked with dried mud. In a metal box, index cards just as the notebooks had described, with names and chilling one-sentence observations. And in the woods behind his house, they found graves. Shallow pits, some barely covered with soil. Bones stacked like firewood. Skulls cracked open, teeth missing. The remains of at least 7 women were identified. Others were too decayed, too fragmented. It was enough. Thomas Grayle was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. Ashwood didn't sleep for weeks. Reporters flooded in, cameras flashing on Main Street. Trucks from major networks parked outside the diner. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. The quiet lumberman who had hidden horrors in his barn. Neighbors turned on one another. How could no one have noticed? How could the sheriff have ignored Laura Whitman's testimony years earlier? Some claimed they had noticed that Thomas was odd, secretive, always watching, but no one had spoken up. Others swore they'd never seen a hint of darkness in him. The town's churches filled with prayer meetings. Parents kept children locked indoors. Women who'd lived in Ashwood during the 1970s and 80s felt sick, realizing how close they might have come to being chosen. And Laura Whitman, older now, hardened by the years, returned to town to testify. She stood on the courthouse steps, eyes burning, and told reporters, I told them what he was. Nobody believed me. If they had, those girls would still be alive." Her words cut through the silence like a knife. The trial began in the spring of 1994. Prosecutors called it one of the most disturbing cases in Pennsylvania's history. They presented photographs, notebooks, forensic evidence. They brought in families of the missing women, who wept as they described years of not knowing. The defense argued the notebooks were fiction, that the bones were animal remains, misidentified, that the FBI had planted half the evidence to close unsolved cases. But the photographs could not be denied, nor could the DNA tests, which matched hair in the jars to missing women. Most chilling of all were the Polaroids. Over 50 of them, showing women bound in the keeper's room. Some appeared unconscious. Some were awake, eyes red from crying. None were alive when the photographs ended. Jurors wept as they were shown. One woman fainted. The trial lasted 4 months. Through it all, Thomas Grayle remained silent. Reporters described him as stone-faced. He rarely spoke to his lawyers, never reacted to testimony, and never looked at the families. But on the final day of the trial, just before sentencing, the judge asked if he had anything to say. For the first time, he smiled. "They call me the keeper," he said. "That's not true. I never kept them. I let them go. I just kept their moments." The courtroom froze. He leaned closer to the microphone, voice steady. Nobody ever remembers people the way they really were. Not their faces, not their voices. They fade. But I remembered them. I kept them perfect. That's all. The judge silenced him quickly. But those words would haunt Ashwood forever. On July 18th, 1994, Thomas Grayle was convicted of 13 counts of murder, with more suspected. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The courthouse erupted with relief. Families clutched one another. Reporters shouted questions. But Laura Whitman, the woman who had survived, told a journalist something that chilled even the FBI agents standing nearby. "They'll never find them all," she said. "Not the bodies. Not the truth. He had too much. Too well. There are more girls out there, buried where no one will ever look. And she was right. Over the next decade, hikers and hunters in the forests around Ashwood occasionally stumbled upon bones. A femur here, a skull there. Enough to hint at more victims, but never enough to name. The keeper's collection was larger than anyone knew. Prison didn't change Thomas Grail. Guard expected him to lash out, to break down, to finally show some emotion. But he didn't. He ate quietly in the mess hall, read books in his cell, and filled the pages of state-issued journals with the same neat handwriting as always. Other inmates feared him, not because he was violent, but because he was too calm. They whispered about him in the yard. Some claimed he stared at them in their sleep. Others swore they heard him talking to people who weren't there. One guard described it best. It's like he's still in that barn, still keeping them, even though he's locked up here. The walls don't matter. He carries it inside him. In 1996, 2 years after his conviction, letters began arriving at the homes of victims' families. Each envelope bore no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. The letters were not threats. They were not apologies. They were observations. To Denise Holt's mother, she hummed when she folded laundry. I don't think you noticed. To the Morris sisters' father, and was braver than Kelly. She tried to shield her. To Marcy Dower's brother, she had a scar on her ankle, shaped like a crescent moon. The details were too precise to be fabricated. Details only someone who had kept them would know. Authorities traced the handwriting. It was Grail's. Somehow, he had been smuggling letters out of prison through other inmates. When confronted, he didn't deny it. They deserve to be remembered, he said. You forget. I don't. The families were shattered all over again. By 1998, fascination with the keeper had spread beyond Pennsylvania. True crime magazines ran cover stories. Documentaries aired late at night, narrated in hushed voices. And then came Evelyn Crane, a young journalist from New York who decided to write a book about him. She visited Grail in prison dozens of times, recording hours of interviews. Unlike the FBI, she didn't demand confessions. She let him talk. What he told her was worse than anything found in his notebooks. He described how he chose his victims, not out of anger, not out of lust, but out of what he called the purity of their patterns. He explained how he followed them, how he mapped their routines, how he knew when their lives intersected with silence. Every life, he told her, is just a rhythm waiting to be interrupted. Evelyn asked him how many there were in total. He smiled. More than you'll ever count. Her book, The Keeper's Silence, was published in 2001. It became a bestseller, but many readers reported being unable to finish it. Not because of the crimes, but because of Grail's voice, which Evelyn captured too well. His calmness, his certainty. One reviewer wrote, "It feels less like you're reading about him, and more like he's sitting in a room with you." Back in Ashwood, the town never healed. The Grail farmhouse was condemned, left to rot. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside, leaving graffiti on the walls, swearing they heard whispers in the barn's charred remains. Parents warned their children never to play in the woods. Hunters carried unease with them, knowing bones might lie beneath their boots. The diner where Laura Whitman once worked shut down. The lumber mill closed. One by one, families moved away, until Ashwood felt more like a ghost town than the thriving community it once was. But some stayed, and those who stayed swore the town was cursed, not by spirits, but by memory. Every missing person, every hollow-eyed photograph on the sheriff's bulletin board, every headline that screamed keeper of SHWOD, it all lingered like smoke that wouldn't clear. In 2005, over a decade into his sentence, Grail finally gave a confession. Not to the FBI, not to his lawyer, to a prison chaplain. One evening, after chapel, Grail asked to speak privately. He sat in the dim room, hands folded, and began recounting every abduction. He described where he'd taken them, how long he'd kept them, how they died. Some he strangled, others he starved. A few, he claimed, faded on their own. The chaplain, shaken to his core, later told authorities he could barely breathe as Grail spoke. It wasn't the cruelty, the chaplain said. It was the serenity. He spoke like a man describing the weather. Most chilling was the final confession. Grail leaned forward, his voice almost tender, and said, "There's still 3 who keep me company. You won't find them. They're not buried. They're waiting. I'm still their keeper." The chaplain asked what he meant. Grail only smiled. To this day, those words remain unexplained. On March 12, 2007, Thomas Grail was found dead in his cell. The official cause, heart failure. He was 61 years old, but rumors spread quickly. Some inmates swore they'd heard him talking to someone the night before, laughing softly. Others claimed his body was found not lying down, but sitting up, eyes open, mouth curved in a faint smile. The prison released no photos. The family, distant cousins who barely knew him, refused to claim body. He was buried in an unmarked grave. And yet, in Ashwood, many insisted his presence never left. After his death, Evelyn Crane, the journalist, published a second book compiling letters, transcripts, and unused notes from their interviews. One passage stood out above all. "I was never hiding," Grail told her. "You all just refused to see. That's the real horror. Not what I did. What you didn't do. The silence kept me safe." That quote spread like wildfire. True crime enthusiasts debated it on forums. Families of other unsolved cases across Pennsylvania began asking whether Grail might be linked. Some begged for new searches of wooded areas, new forensic testing of bones long buried in evidence boxes. The FBI quietly admitted that at least 8 additional disappearances matched his timeline and methods. But no proof ever surfaced, and so the silence remained. 2 years after Grail's death, in the autumn of 2009, a group of high school boys were exploring the woods near Ashwood. They were hunting raccoons with flashlights when one of them tripped over something hard. At first, he thought it was a branch, but when his beam fell across it, he saw a pale curve poking from the earth. A skull. The sheriff's office came. The site was excavated. They found not one skeleton, but 3, buried shallow, arranged in a triangle, hands folded neatly over their chests. DNA tests later confirmed they were women who had gone missing in 1982, 1985, and 1987. One of them was wearing a necklace her family still remembered, a small silver cross, untarnished after decades in the ground. It was proof, years after Grail's death, that his reach had been wider than anyone imagined. And yet, when the remains were reburied, townsfolk whispered something darker. The way the skeletons had been positioned wasn't haphazard. It was ritualistic, like they weren't buried as victims, but as keepers themselves. Despite being condemned, the Grail farmhouse refused to collapse. Teenagers trespassed constantly. Some stole items, old jars, rusted tools, scraps of paper left behind. One boy even bragged about finding a notebook hidden in the attic insulation, its pages filled with lists of names nobody recognized. The sheriff seized the notebook. To this day, it has never been released. More disturbing were the stories from those who entered the barn ruins. Visitors swore they heard chains rattling when the wind was still. Some claimed to find Polaroids buried in the dirt, faces half melted by fire, eyes staring through plastic haze. A few even insisted they saw him. A figure just at the corner of the eye, standing where the keeper's room once was. Thin hair, notebook in hand, watching. The farmhouse was finally demolished in 2014, but the land remains vacant, unsold, avoided even by hunters. Locals say nothing will grow there. After Grail's death, cases began cropping up across the state. Women abducted, kept for short periods, sometimes photographed. In most instances, the perpetrators were caught quickly, but the press gave them a name, keeper copycats. Some were obsessed with him, admitting they had read the keeper's silence and felt inspired. Others denied any connection, but investigators often found Grail's name underlined in their journals. One chilling case in 2016 involved a man in Ohio who had recreated the keeper's room in his basement, chains and all. He was arrested before he claimed a victim, but when asked why, he answered, because he remembered them. Nobody else did. It proved Grail's words lived on, infecting minds long after his body rotted. The woman who had escaped him, Laura Whitman, lived a quiet life after testifying. She moved from town to town, never staying long. She never married, never had children. In 2020, at the age of 60, she was interviewed for a podcast on unsolved crimes. Her voice cracked as she recalled the night she fled the keeper's room. But when the interviewer asked her what haunted her most, she didn't mention the chains or his silence or the smell of the barn. She said, "It's that I still feel him watching. Sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I can hear a pencil scratching on paper. And I know, wherever he is, that he's still writing me down." She died of cancer a year later. At her funeral, someone left an unmarked envelope on her grave. Inside was a single index card. It read, "Laura Whitman, brave." No one knows who placed it there. Ashwood is nearly gone now. Businesses closed. Houses abandoned. The population has dwindled to less than 500. But people still talk. They talk about strange sounds in the forest, about hunters who vanish without a trace, about campers who return claiming they saw a man standing among the trees, notebook in hand, eyes reflecting light like an animal's. The sheriff's office insists it's paranoia, but whispers spread anyway. The keeper isn't gone. He never really left. True crime enthusiasts still debate the real number of Grail's victims. Some say 15. Others argue it could be over 40. The FBI files remain sealed, filled with redactions. But in Ashwood, numbers don't matter. What matters is silence. The silence that allowed him to thrive. The silence that let his barn burn for years without anyone daring to look closer. The silence that still hangs heavy over the town, choking it like smoke. And maybe that was his final victory. Not the bodies, not the photographs, but the silence. Because silence keeps him alive. Because every time someone in Ashwood refuses to speak, refuses to remember, Thomas Grail, the keeper, remains. And if you ever drive through that town, past the empty lots and shuttered stores, if you ever walk into the diner and whisper his name, you'll see what silence looks like. Every head will lower. Every conversation will stop. And you'll realize, in Ashwood, the keeper is still keeping.